It's from Kit Clarenberg over at Mint Press. He says, on March 25th, Donald Trump signed an executive order declassifying all documentation related to Crossfire Hurricane. It sounds like whoever named this FBI investigation was like a big fan of monster trucks or something. They were like, it's Crossfire Hurricane that we're involved in. FBI's 2016 investigation into alleged collusion between Russia and then candidate Donald Trump. So when Trump signed the executive order to declassify these, it resurrected buried documents that cast new light on the Steele dossier and when exactly it was known to be false. So we now know it's false. Of course, I and some independent media, mainly not mainstream media, were covering the fact that it was all garbage early on. And this was not me loving Donald Trump. I called him a despicable, racist, disgusting piece of megalomaniacal garbage, parasitic fecal matter. Listen, I was doing that old school, okay? I was doing that back in the 1990s. But it had to do with me caring about what the truth was. I knew that the Democratic Party was upset that they were losing to Donald Trump, upset that they had lost to Donald Trump, and they created this whole Russiagate thing to basically try and mostly they succeeded, get a lot of Americans to believe, oh no, Hillary Clinton never would have lost if it weren't for Russia. I don't need to go through all the details, but you guys probably remember that every pillar of Russiagate collapsed over the years. Now, some of us, like me, were covering it from day one, or you get a couple of weeks in and you start looking into this stuff and you realize it's all garbage, but every pillar collapsed, whether it was the Facebook ads in the Internet Research Agency, or whether it was, Russia leaked the DNC emails to WikiLeaks, which was proven false, or whether it was this Steele dossier. The Steele dossier, it was used to do basically two things. One was to open up this FBI investigation into Trump-Russia collusion, and two was to basically tell the American public, this really authentic and real dossier by a former MI6 dude, James Bond. He has revealed that Russia has compromised on Trump and that they're working with him in order to rig the election. And so it was used to do all that garbage. Anyway, we have new documents, new revelations about when exactly the government first started to figure out that it was false. Back to Kit Clarenberg, he says, it has long been confirmed that the FBI relied heavily on Steele's discredited dossier to secure warrants against Trump aide Carter Page, despite grave internal concerns about the reliability. Steele's sole subsource, quote unquote, for all its lurid allegations, openly admitted in interviews with the FBI he could offer no corroboration for any of the dossier's claims. But you got to remember, we didn't know that stuff back in 2016, 2017. Such inconvenient facts and damning disclosures were nonetheless concealed from the public for several years following the dossier's January 2017 publication by BuzzFeed News, which is now defunct. I don't think a lot of us are crying a lot of tears over the loss of BuzzFeed News. It became the central component of the Russiagate narrative. I would argue one of them, but a conspiracy theory that was a major rallying point for countless mainstream journalists, pundits, public figures, Western intelligence officials, and elected lawmakers. In the process, Steele attained mythological status. NBC News dubbed the former MI6 operative a real-life James Bond. I mean, can you guys remember how crazy the hype got over the Steele dossier and Christopher Steele? And we didn't see any interviews with him or anything. So he was like this, it was a mythical guy. Like you just hear whispers of him. It was like Jason Bourne or something. Like what? The Steele dossier, Christopher Steele. Oh my God. Someone at MI6 says that Trump is controlled by Russia. Then it must be true. Leading media outlets invested enormous time, energy, and money into verifying the dossier's claims without success. Undeterred, legacy reporters, meaning corporate media, pieces of human excrement, they continued to pretend that it was all clearly true. They relied on a roster of mainstream, quote, Russia experts. That word expert can be used to cover up all kinds of fucking idiots, including prominent British and U.S. military and intelligence veterans and briefings from anonymous officials to reinforce Steele's credibility and the likely veracity of his dossier. One other thing I'll just throw in here is a little kernel to remember. Do you remember that Hillary Clinton and the Clinton campaign, the week after they lost, for like 5 days, they blamed it on the FBI. They blamed it on James Comey because James Comey had reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton and her laptops, et cetera, et cetera. He reopened that like a week before the election. And so Clinton campaign blamed the FBI for their loss for like a few days. And then clearly someone inside the Clinton campaign goes, going up against the FBI and the CIA and the deep state, that's probably a bad idea to blame them for our loss. But you know who everyone can get excited about us blaming? Russia. They pivoted, and James Comey became a fucking hero, right? Oh my God, a liberal hero. He stood up to Trump. Yeah. He absolutely the polar opposite. That was some serious brand washing, man. That was getting the, when you get you get the shoulder into it, scrubbing when you're brand washing, just get your back and shoulder into they really scrubbed his image. And he went from liberal goon to the liberal hero. Legacy reporters continued to act like it was verified, that the Steele dossier was verified. The now defunct private investigations firm GPW Group was, in early 2017, secretly unearthing vast amounts of damaging material that fatally undermined the dossier's content and comprehensively dismantled Steele's previously unimpeachable public persona. So this is the stuff that the government had access to that you and I did not have access to until like a week ago. The fact that internally, they, in 2017, knew that the Steele dossier was garbage. They were unearthing. The private investigators were unearthing it. Others were unearthing it. So they're finding out that the Steele dossier is not based on anything, is flimsy as shit. And yet, none of that is revealed to the public for years. The picture that emerged of Steele sharply contrasted with his mainstream portrayal as a superstar. One operative who acted as Steele's manager when he began working with MI6 and later supervised him at 2 further points, described him as average, middle of the road, and stating that he never shined in any of his positions. Another suggested Steele's founding of Orbis, that was his company, Orbis Business Intelligence, was a source of some incredulity within MI6 due to his underwhelming professional history. Sources consulted by GPW were even more critical of Fusion GPS chief Glenn Simpson. One journalist described him as a hack without a license or the contacts to do actual investigations. Oh yeah, Fusion GPS helped write the Steele dossier or outsourced it to Steele, I guess. Work ostensibly conducted by his firm to others while skimming commissions. Overall, GPW concluded quality and level of the sourcing was greatly exaggerated in order to give the dossier its allegations more credibility. GPW's investigation also noted that Steele's dossier, the hyperbole and inaccuracies were typical of hyperactive imaginations of subcontractors widely used in the business intelligence sector. This was not confirmed until July 2020. So all this stuff is being revealed to our government in 2017. And for 3 more years, the American public is told to still basically believe the Steele dossier. Even though we know, the government knows it's bullshit, and some independent media, like myself and Aaron Mate and a few others, were talking about how insanely false this Russiagate hoax was. That month, in July 2020, the Senate Judiciary Committee released notes taken by FBI agents during 2017 interviews with Igor Danchenko, Steele's subsource and the dossier's effective author, a Washington think tank journeyman jailed years earlier for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. He was investigated by the FBI for potentially serving as a Kremlin agent. Danchenko admitted he had been fed much of the dossier's salacious content by his Russian drinking buddies, who lacked any high-level access. Steele then embroidered their dud information further. So Danchenko sits down with his Russian drinking buddies. They go, oh, yeah, I heard I heard he was in a Moscow hotel getting pissed on by prostitutes. Danchico brings that to Christopher Steele, a basically middle-of-the-road rejected MI6 officer, and he then writes it down and goes, "Oh, this is good stuff. This is good stuff. What else you got for me? Can we add more to the whole Pea Party thing? I was really liking that." And that was like the main source of this garbage, which again, not only was one of the pillars of Russiagate, because some of the people who were trying to defend Russiagate, one of the things they'd say, what are the odds that you could end up with 3 or 4 pillars of Russiagate and they could all be garbage? Well, the odds are pretty high if you are the Democratic Party, most of the U.S. Mainstream media basically corroborating to agree on all of this garbage. A lot of the deep state, when they're all working together, creating this shit. You got the DNC basically funding the Steele dossier. You got the DNC in the Clinton campaign funding the crowd strike, which found that the Russians had hacked into the DNC servers. You've got the DNC and mainstream media saying, oh, these ads on Facebook that no one ever saw, the average expenditure was $3 and 56% of them appeared after the election. Well, those ads, they really rigged this election. It's all the same fucking people working together, create this sham. Yeah, if these things were siloed, if they were all brought forward independently, not connected to any similar groups, then maybe you'd have a point about what a coincidence. But when it's the same goddamn people making all this garbage up, it's nothing. You got nothing. So then Kit Klarenberg reminds us that the dossier was commissioned by Clinton's campaign as a contingency in the event she lost the election. The Clinton campaign paid for this Steele dossier prior to her election loss. However, as GPW's source close to Steele noted, when the MI6 operative took the work, the prevailing perception was that it was very unlikely Trump would win. As a result, Steele may have had the motivation to fill the dossier with unverified material, believing it would never be used for its intended purpose. He also had a commercial incentive to exaggerate his high-level access. At the heart of this, you have a kind of rejected MI6 guy. Yes, he wasn't technically rejected, but he was middle of the road, never did anything spectacular at MI6. Now he's out of MI6. He's looking to make big money. Apparently, he'd been shopping around to weapons contractors like, Lockheed Martin and shit to try and work for them in the intelligence areas, and they didn't want him. Then the Clinton campaign comes along and says, can you write up a dossier on how Trump has been compromised by Russia? And he says, absolutely. Can I? I could write that up tonight. In fact, I have some old Russian drinking buddies. I think I have some stories to tell. Anyway, that is the Kit Klarenberg's article over at Mint Press on these files that have now been revealed. Trump declassified them, but they are getting very little attention, even though it shows that this charade, this bullshit, this dumpster fire, even though they continued to cover up this absolute bullshit, absolute dumpster fire for 4 more years, and it was ultimately revealed in 2020 because Trump was the president and he had an interest in revealing it. That's why a lot of this stuff got revealed, and that's why this is getting revealed now. But what I was going to say is you cannot really overstate the ripple effects of, how many years? 3 years of Russiagate hoax? I was covering it at Redacted Tonight, like in depth, for years. It was this story that wouldn't die. It both wouldn't die because more and more things would come out as to how utterly false it was. But it also wouldn't die because the Democrats had a big interest, and certain aspects of the deep state had a big interest in keeping it going. They needed it to be true. It wouldn't die for both those reasons. And the ripple effects are huge. Because not only do you have the effects on a lot of the country believing that Russia has rigged our elections. I mean, imagine the fear and insecurity, which are both very useful things for controlling a populace. Imagine the fear and insecurity of knowing Russia can just rig our elections, can control our president. Where exactly that leads the average human to start thinking. Also, it probably has led to the continued downfall of mainstream media, which I'm not going to mourn for mainstream media. I've perhaps done as much work as anybody on explaining to everyone just how fake our mainstream corporate media is. But when you tell people something is absolutely true, a major conspiracy that rigged the presidential election and continued to rig the national zeitgeist, the culture, the society, continued to rig it for years to come. When you tell them this major conspiracy has taken over our system, and you do that day in and day out for 3-4 years, and it all collapses. What is your average American, at least the ones that know it collapsed? I don't know. What percentage of the American populace do you think continues to believe that this was real? Because the false reality is covered 1,000 times more than the revelations, right? Did CNN do a story on Mueller dropping the 14 indictments on the internet clickbait agency in Russia? They probably did one story, maybe one day's worth of stories on how Mueller ultimately dropped all of the indictments on the clickbait agency in Russia, because they couldn't prove any impact on the election. They also couldn't prove any connection to the Russian government, any real connection, any strong connection, or that the Russian government told them to do anything. So they had to drop all the indictments. CNN, just to give one example, had covered the indictments every day for, I don't know what, months, years. And then let's say they spend one day saying, they dropped the indictments. I don't even think it was one day. I think it was like 2 stories. What does America walk away believing? So what percentage of America still believes this shit? It's got to be a third or something. Anyway, to the ones who do know that it has all been proven false, it shows that all of our mainstream media is just full of shit, which I guess I'll take that. I'll take that as a positive coming out of this.